This is Dr. Paul Thomlinson from Compass Health Network. I'm doing a series on applying psychology to getting through the current circumstances we're faced with grace and humanity. This one is called It Makes for a Great Story, telling the future story of how you handled things today. Right now, in the face of a global pandemic that is disrupting nearly everything in life, it might be a good time to learn from the wisdom of the ages. To remember that our forebears knew a great deal about how to deal, how to get over, how to get through the storm. I've been reading a great book by William Irvine, who's a philosopher at Wright State University, called The Stoic Challenge, a philosopher's guide to becoming tougher, calmer, and more resilient. And I'm convinced that we have a lot to learn from the Stoics that applies to right now. I'm talking about the Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece like Zeno, Seneca, and Epictetus. The Stoics were from every imaginable background, from slave to soldier to emperor. But what they had in common in the face of tremendous challenges of war and famine and pestilence was they focused not on the external world, but only on what was solely in their own control. Their own thoughts, their own actions, their beliefs. In this way, they have a lot in common with one of my favorite psychologists of all, the great Viktor Frankl, who wrote, in the context of a Nazi death camp experience, "Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." When we think of being stoic, we think that means showing no emotion, stiff upper lip, and that sort of thing. But actually, the Stoics were not anti-emotion at all, and they recognized the importance of emotions in life. They had nothing against positive emotions like joy and love, but they just believed our negative emotions could be limiting and should be dealt with differently, especially in times of distress and challenge. So I want to share one of the so-called frames from the Stoics. A way of framing setbacks and difficult times that helps us deal with them better right now. As one of my good friends and favorite psychologists, Dr. Joel Hogus, often says, we humans are story-making critters. We are by nature makers and tellers of stories. And there's great power in this. We get to forge the story of how we dealt with challenges and setbacks and tell them to anyone who might listen, most of all ourselves. So one way to harness this very human characteristic is to use the Stoic storytelling frame. As William Irvine says in his book, when you've been set back, think in terms of the setback story you might tell in the future. It may be a story about how frustrated you were, how mean and stupid people are, or how unfair the world is. It can, in other words, be a truly boring story, the essence of which people have likely heard hundreds of times before. With a little effort on your part, though, you can write, with your behavior, a story that is not just interesting, but potentially uplifting to those who hear it." Unquote. What a great goal. When we experience setbacks, and I think we can all agree that we're in the middle of one now, this future storytelling frame can soften the blow of whatever it is you're going through. How is that? Well, it's because of an intentional focus, not on how bad things are, how much you've been wronged or devastated, but on what you must do, what you have to do as the main actor in your story, for the story to come out right, for the story to come out the way you want it to, the way you want it to sound when you're telling it someday in the future to your friends or to the classic, your own kids and grandkids. You want to tell a future story with a satisfying conclusion in which you brought to bear your highest self, your best self, your competencies, your kindness, your strength, your courage, even while being afraid. Because after all, that's what bravery is, right? It's not being unafraid, but feeling fear and doing it anyway, doing what needs to be done to bring the story to a good conclusion. When using the storytelling frame, as Irvine points out, if things get even stranger and more difficult during a crisis, quote, rather than getting even more upset, feel grateful that it puts an interesting wrinkle into your setback story, unquote. But here's an important thing to remember about this frame and how to use it. It does not mean that you shout and backstab and angrily undercut others, showing no compassion for them through this pandemic crisis, and then make up some inauthentic story about how you handled it with grace and skill. That's not the point. For this frame to work for you, the future story has to be true. What does that mean for you today, right now? How does this help us in the midst of a real and substantial setback like this? Think about what story you will tell, maybe only to yourself, but likely to many others, about how you handled this test. And it is a test of epic proportions. How you handled it with humanity, competence, courage, and resilience. Then use that as the script for how you act now. Every word you say to yourself and others, every act of kindness and compassion and sacrifice that you make, that's the story. That's who you want to be. That's who you are. And your story matters.